All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Human Monsters. And if you've been listening to the show for a long time, throughout its entire run, you have noticed that child abuse cases come up quite a bit. In fact, I've done 27 of them to this point. And I'm talking with Andrew Gold today because he's a specialist in many areas, but one of them is actually the subject of pedophilia. And so we're going to talk about that today. Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew.
Oh, thanks for having me on. What a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, before we go on, just give me a sketchy synopsis of your background, what it is you do, and how you've arrived at being a specialist in these areas.
Well, I'm a journalist and documentary maker, and I'm a linguist as well. I love languages. So I speak 5 languages, and I lived around the world documenting what I thought would be the most intriguing, fringy people that I could find in societies and subcultures. So I made things about exorcism and UFOs and searching for just the strangest parts of life. And I moved to Germany because I wanted German to be my 5th language. So I moved to Berlin and I looked around at like what could be my next topic. And there were a few things in Germany, of course. There's a few, there's like, I don't know what you can say on YouTube, but the people from the 1930s and all that in Germany, there's communism out there as well. There's loads of interesting things in Germany. But what struck me as a topic I wanted to look into was that Germany has what they say is the world's only clinic for pedophiles that never reports them to authorities. So as soon as I heard about that, I thought, okay, this is fascinating, and that's going to be my next topic. So I spent the next 2 years embedding myself with their community of non-offending pedophiles to try and understand them, to try and see which of them I could trust, to meet the clinicians who were working as therapists with them and ask them questions about it all. And it was just the strangest year or two of my life by some distance.
Well, it's strange that there's only one on the planet because, if there's anything we need more, it's that if the pedophile doesn't want to offend, we should provide a service that helps them to refrain from doing so. But a lot of people just have this attitude, well, if they've even had the thought of doing such a thing, we should just execute them. And so many of them are afraid of coming forward. And I'm not that I'm trying to elicit sympathy, but again, if a lot of people would likely think, they should have gone for counseling. They should have found a way to deal with these urges instead of acting on them. Well, considering that many representatives of the psychiatric establishment won't treat them, what they need to realize is that it would be a valuable public service if they did. So in terms of your immersion in that, I guess, subculture, if you will, did you write a series of articles or did you make a documentary about it? What was the end result?
I wrote an article for a publication called Unheard, but it was a difficult process because a lot of the stuff I wanted to say was quite similar to what you just said. Again, without eliciting sympathy, so to speak, but just to look at both sides and to understand everything. And as you can imagine, they were very, very careful. Even a publication called Unheard, which is supposed to be, that anti-censorship and that kind of thing, open-minded, were very, very careful. And it ended up being, which so often happens, an article that I didn't write. As far, my name was on it, but it wasn't the article I wrote. I did write a book of my time of doing it for the 2 years. It was the working title was We Need to Talk About Max. Max was the first non-offending pedophile that I met, although he said he was non-offending. That's all I have to take people at their word. I don't just trust them blithely. And I started on an audio project which won an award and some funding last year from the Radio and Audio Fund Awards Fund or something in the UK. So it's all sort of at a place of what to do next. And I also interviewed one of the pedophiles who was a 18-year-old head boy or class president of his school. for my podcast On the Edge with Andrew Gold. And I wouldn't do that now, because that was now a year and a half ago, and I wouldn't do it now just because of the demonetization stuff on YouTube and all that stuff. You just can't. I'd be taken off of YouTube or whatever. But yeah, I did that stuff. So the problem was the book. That's what I was really excited about, because I wrote the whole thing, almost the whole thing. And I do feel like it's fascinating. Of course I do. I wrote it myself, I'm biased, but basically every publication, a literary agency took it, but every publication said, like, we won't even look at this. And what I was told is, look, go and write another book, because I hadn't written any books. Go and write another book and try this as your second book. But to go in with this as your debut book, that's not going to fly. So I'm writing a book at the moment about the psychology of secrets and secrecy. And I mentioned some of these pedophiles as well, because, of course, they have to keep secrets more than anybody, and what that does to them and how interesting that is. And hopefully that will be the next book.
Have you tried self-publishing the book, maybe on Amazon or something?
I thought about it, and I thought, you know what, like, it felt like a once in a lifetime thing. The access that I got, like, I feel like it's really something. I feel quite passionate about it, and I thought, back when I wrote it, this was before I had any kind of following on YouTube. So now I've got my 80,000 subscribers or whatever. So that's something now, although I don't know how many of them would buy the book. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to release this as a second book, I think. Maybe a publisher will help me really get it out there. By that time, maybe I've got 100,000 or 200,000 subscribers who will all go and buy the book, or at least a percentage of them will. And it will make a bit, because the one thing I don't want is to put all that work in and then just put it out there and it just tanks and no one reads it. And then you just become the guy who wrote loads about pedophiles and no one read his book. And it felt a bit weird. I didn't want to be that guy who's like self-publishing and that's my only book and I brought it out. I'd rather it's like it's gone through a rigorous process of publishers and all that kind of thing before it goes out.
Yeah, I've self-published a couple of books and they pretty much had that result. Yeah. They don't, it's and it's hard to promote books on Amazon to bring attention to it. And so what did you gather from some of the medical professionals that you interviewed for the book? Because I know that it's not considered a sexual orientation, it's a paraphilia. And there are many who feel that it's a mental illness. In fact, the DSM does consider it to be a mental illness. So what was their verdict on pedophilia?
Mm-hmm. There's no consensus. That's the first thing that I found. Like, there's, or at least very little consensus to be found. So some people, as you correctly point out, will call it a mental illness. Some will say it's sort of part of their sexuality. These things are so nebulous and abstract that we can't, sexuality, it's impossible. One person I interviewed, I had him on my podcast, called Dr. James Cantor. He thinks there's a link between pedophilia and left-handedness. And that's mad. Like, no one expected that. That was like this weird thing. But he found that because he did these tests. And basically, the reason that was relevant is because left-handedness or right-handedness is something that is apparently decided before birth. I say decided, but like it's something that comes to be before birth. And so that would imply that if there is some sort of link, not suggesting at all that most left-handed people are pedophiles, but just that there's some link, that if there is a link, that it is something intrinsic to the human. And that flies in the face of what a lot of doctors are saying. They tend to go towards this theory, a theory of like things got stuck, that an 8-year-old might be attracted to another 8-year-old in some sort of childish way, and a 9-year-old to a 9-year-old, and so on. And something might happen when, let's say, they're 11, and it stops, their age of attraction stops going up with their own age. And that's when we have a problem. And I quite liked that theory because that sort of went along with my very amateur, idea of it. I look at someone like Michael Jackson. I know there's a lot of debate about the truth behind the Michael Jackson stuff, but let's say he was a pedophile for argument's sake. He had an awful childhood, terrible childhood. He was abused and all sorts of things happened to him. And it makes sense to me that he was stunted at his childhood age. I mean, he certainly behaved like he was a child in many respects. So I quite liked that idea, but there's no real consensus on how it happens, how we stop it happening. There's only this idea of the therapy and what you can do to stop people offending.
And yeah, you mentioned that no publishing companies would publish the book, and it's been hard even to get, I imagine a newspaper or a magazine to publish articles because, ideally in journalism, particularly in reporting, you want to just, state the facts without a bias, without your own opinion baked into it. But it seems like when it comes to this topic, they want bias. They want you to spend the entire piece, whether it's a book or just an article. They want you to constantly condemn these people. And is it, did you encounter that? Like, were you accused of going too light on them?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was just interviewed by quite a reputable British journalist for an article about YouTube censorship, which is another topic, I guess. And she was just saying the same thing about we often sort of criticize maybe companies who are quite censorial, and we say, what is it that they're trying to do? At the end of the day, though, they're just companies who want to do the safest possible thing so they can continue earning money. So why would a publisher take a risk on a book about a subject that it might do really well, okay, but it's not going to be Harry Potter. It's not going to change the publisher's life. And it could change their life in a negative way if it's taken the wrong way. The same for a newspaper or publication. So I do get it. At the end of the day, they just want to save their own hides. That's what that's about. And I have had that. But it's not just publications, it's listeners and viewers. There'll be people listening, nodding their heads right now, but there'll be many who want to jump down your throat as soon as you say things, and they want to assume malice. They want to assume that you are sympathizing with offenders, and that's the same as sympathizing with those of them who are not offenders but have this, whatever it might be, we can call it a disability or an illness. They're two very different things. And it's complicated. People don't like complicated ideas. They like to say, hey, I'm on this side and you're on that side. Well, if you do split it into that binary, then who wants to be on the side of the pedophile, right? So if it's binary like that, if that's how people are going to interpret it, I think all of us would rather not be on that side. And we know from just status, for example, we know that prisoners, there's loads of stories about people in prison who will always put the pedophile as the lowest of the low in terms of status. I spoke to one, again, on my podcast, interviewed another prisoner. He was in for tax fraud, but he said that they all sort of jumped with glee whenever they brought in a new batch of pedophiles because all the other prisoners could look down on them. And it's a different thing, by the way, because these are pedophiles. If they're in prison for it, they've offended. So we are talking about people who perhaps deserve our admonishment. But yeah, complicated. It's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah. Have you covered? There's one British pedophile who's really become notorious. Richard Huckle. You must be familiar with his case, right? He's especially brutal.
Yeah, Richard Huckle. I'm just going to see which one he was because there's so many over the years, and I did interview a few British ones. He must have abused hundreds of children. Went to Southeast Asia, I think it was, or maybe like Vietnam, Thailand, those areas where there's a lot of pedophilic sex tourism. And he was one of the worst. I think he was killed in prison actually. Yes, strangled and stabbed. And I'm not surprised. And like I say, there's a huge difference between a lot of the guys that I met who said to me, at least they said, and I'll always emphasize that because I don't know what they did, but they said they would never, ever, ever do something to a child. There's a world of difference between that person and Richard Huckle. That is just, and this is what a lot of the clinicians in Germany were saying, is that a lot of offending pedophiles are actually psychopaths. They're not always even pedophiles. They don't even have the attraction to children necessarily. It's just about finding an easy target, somebody that they can dominate, and it's easy to be for a child. So, for example, the person, have you heard of Madeleine McCann?
Yes, I've heard of that case. Yeah.
Yeah. So she was, I guess, 20 years ago now, kidnapped or taken in Portugal while an English family, I think they were doctors, were on holiday, and we never found her, and it's very, very sad. And I think she was a particularly nice looking family and middle class and all that stuff, so it really got a lot of press attention. And a lot of people now think it was this German guy called, was it Chris? Let me just quickly look up. Madeleine McCann, Chris. It's like a, hang on, here he is. Christian Bruckner, right? Christian Bruckner is like the lead suspect in that case. But Christian Bruckner also raped a lot of adult women. So it's very possible that, you know, he did it and he did do whatever he might have done with Madeleine McCann, but he wouldn't necessarily then be a pedophile. We're just talking about a psychopath who gets off and taking advantage of anyone they can find. So a lot of them are that, and then a lot of pedophiles, meanwhile, don't ever offend. So you've got those two sides. You've got psychopaths who offend and are not even pedophiles, and you've got pedophiles who are, you know, would never offend. And then you've got in the in-between section. And that's where this clinic in Germany does their work, because they're never going to be able to do therapy on a psychopath and say, stop attacking women and children. It's just not going to happen. They don't need to do therapy on the pedophiles who say they would never, ever offend. It's not necessary. And maybe they live their lives and they're fine and they have adult relationships sometimes. It's the ones in between who are not necessarily psychopaths, but they don't always know right from wrong, and they need somebody to instruct and counsel them. And a lot of those cases, this is something we see in all kinds of criminality. They will convince themselves, cognitive bias, that it's okay. They'll say, hey, this something happened to me when I was younger and I'm fine. I think it's okay. And they need to be disabused of that concept. So that's the main thing the therapy does. You'll be amazed speaking to these guys what they will convince themselves is okay and that they're not bad people, because nobody wants to consider themselves a bad person. And the problem is that when we start saying, you know, just criticizing and saying like, we can't even talk about those people, they just go into the far corners of the internet and they only meet other people like them. They only speak to each other and they just reaffirm what they all think. And that's really dangerous. So what I would say to anyone who's going, oh, I can't even listen to this and whatever, I would say to those people, you're actually harming your own children and other children by saying that. There needs to be, and this is what this German therapy situation believes as well, there has to be dialogue. You have to be able to speak about it without fear that someone will say, oh, you're sympathizing with the bad guys. Because even if you hate those bad guys, I hate them, whatever, we need to stop them offending children. That's the main objective. It has to be.
Yeah. Oh yeah, prevention is as important as prosecution.
Yeah, I think more.
Oh yeah. That's right. You mentioned pedophiles saying yes. So like, you know, I had an interaction with a full-grown man when I was a boy, and it wasn't traumatic for me. Did you watch a documentary called Chicken Hawk in your research?
No, what's that?
Well, it's basically a pedophilia propaganda film. I mean, it's legal. It's on YouTube. Oh. But yeah, they have some teenage boys saying, yeah, when I was like 8 years old, I had a relationship with a man, and they interviewed members of NAMBLA for the documentary. So yeah,
yes, it's South Park.
They definitely put a lot of spin on it. So what did you go on? Yeah. No, it's okay. You go on.
I was just going to say it's a really, I mean, morality is very complicated. I think we sometimes forget that. We forget that in many senses. We forget that 30 years ago, morality around the world and in particular countries was very different to how it is now. And we get quite arrogant sometimes because we say, oh, they were so wrong. And we don't think enough about how wrong we are compared to the morality of in 30 years or 50 years time. Basically, more and more, I guess, the older I get, and I'm sure a lot of people might relate to this, you do start to think, God, we're a society of people. We're like Lord of the Flies, you know, we don't necessarily even like each other or know each other. But here we are in the UK, for example, on this little small island, 70 million of us, and we've decided we've got to find a set of rules to live by. And we know that in the past, pedophilia was allowed in certain circumstances. We know that the Romans engaged in it. We know the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. We know the Japanese samurai situation. You know, a samurai would have like a young boy or whatever. But there were also so many, you know, slavery was also very common, not just the slavery of the last couple hundred years, but slavery, of course, of the ancients. So there are loads and loads of things that, like, I'm sure humans potentially can survive with or can live with, or maybe they can't. And, there's no way of knowing how one particular child might react. And that is why you'll get those propaganda videos.
Sure.
You'll get these people. It might very well be. There might be people listening and something happened to them and they think, well, I don't care. It didn't really do much to me, But it's just, we've decided as a society that it's wrong. The vast majority of us agree on it, like 99.999%. And I think the vast majority of people who were offended as, abused as children also attest to the fact that it's the worst thing that can ever happen to them. It completely screwed up their lives. It ruined everything. So there'll always be anomalies, and there'll always be arguments. And they do write these things. You do get these pedophiles I've come across who write these really flowery languaged long essays about why it's okay and it's a beautiful. I mean, just think of Nabokov. Was it Nabokov? Lolita.
Lolita,
yeah. He wrote beautifully and passionately about such an abhorrent subject. So you'll always get those arguments, but the overwhelming majority of children who have encountered that just describe it as the worst thing you can imagine.
And what is available in the psychiatric literature along the lines of what you've written? Is there anything that someone can turn to where they want to understand it more?
I don't think so. I try to look into it. I try to find stuff. You can find more academic stuff, but not. I've not seen a journalist do it. One of the things that inspired me is I'm a big fan of the writer John Ronson, who I got to interview and now befriend, and he's great. And he wrote the psychopath test. He also wrote So You've Been Publicly Shamed, about sort of censorship and stuff, which was brilliant. But I wanted this to be like the psychopath test. And the psychopath test, he goes and meets lots of psychopaths, and he gives us an insight in quite a funny and light way, which was going to be a bit more difficult with pedophiles, of course, but into who these people are, the psychopaths, because they live among us. About 1 out of 100 or so people are considered probably to be psychopaths. Well, it's the same number with pedophiles. So if you look at the US, 350 million people population, well, 1%, you're looking at, what was that, 3.5 million, which is more than the army. So, an army of pedophiles would outnumber the actual army in the US.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the same in most countries. So it's an extraordinary amount of the population. They live among us. Many of them work with children. It's one of the things I found. And I'm speaking anecdotally here when I say that. I don't want people to then start looking at teachers and suspecting them. Most teachers are not pedophiles, but most pedophiles are either teachers or janitors or camp counselors. And that doesn't mean that anyone should suspect those people at all. It's just that, 1 out of 100 of them or 2 out of 100 of them might be pedophiles. And it's a weird thing, because I remember saying to some of the guys I met, if I was a non-offending pedophile, the one thing I would do is avoid that. I don't want, it's like an alcoholic working behind a bar. And they were just like, they just kept saying, you don't get it. They were like, you don't get it. I'll never offend, but I just need to be near them. There seems to be sort of a platonic love that extends beyond the sexual thing. It's all confused in one bubble, and it's very, very bizarre.
And beyond, the rubric of their paraphilia and how, in most cases they were offended against as children, what did you find was a common denominator in terms of their general personality, their disposition? How did they come across to you outside of all that?
It's very hard to know how much bias I have, because obviously I'm meeting them under such weird circumstances. The first person I met was this guy Max, and he said to meet at a public swimming pool, which is very popular in Germany to have these kinds of things. In the summer you go to the outdoor swimming pools, the Schwimmbad, and I didn't realize that's where he wanted to meet. He just gave me an address. And when I looked it up on Google Maps, I was like, what? That's a swimming pool. So to meet him, I had to pay like $5 or whatever to enter a swimming pool to meet and talk with him. And it was just a weird thing to do as a journalist, particularly because I hadn't had this book confirmed by anyone. I hadn't had any TV shows confirmed. So I thought, all I am right now as an independent journalist is just a guy in a swimming pool with a pedophile. And when I got there, I realized who he was, just because he did look a little bit like, he was wearing Speedos. and a t-shirt that sort of went over the Speedos. It looked like he was sort of naked from the waist down. He was a little overweight, I suppose, and a little nervous, but then the circumstances, of course he's nervous meeting a journalist to talk about it. And the worst part, though, was that he had a child with him. He had this little girl who was about 11 years old. And I just sort of was flabbergasted. I was lost for words. And I waited for her to go off, swimming or whatever she did. And I said to him, "Who's the girl?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm babysitting her." And I was like, "What do you mean you're babysitting her? You're a pedophile." And he was like, "Yeah, well, the woman knows that I'm a pedophile and she's fine with it." And I was like, "What? The woman's fine." So I ended up tracking down the woman, who ended up being this ultra left-wing woman who saw pedophiles as a protected minority, or that they should be protected. And I was like, I get what you're saying, because some of what she's saying resonates with what you and I were saying earlier, right? But she's actually thinking the thing that people think that maybe you and I are thinking, which is like, we really need to defend them. She's gone way too far on this, and she's actually letting her kids be exposed to them. She's doing tests, experiments on her own children by letting them be babysat by a guy that we know is apparently a non-offending pedophile. So I was just like, it hit me, and I can talk about it now almost desensitized, because this was now 2-3 years ago at the swimming pool. But it was like, you don't forget an encounter like that. I had to go and sit down afterwards in a park, just on my own, and just sort of think about what I'd just been around. It was a really emotional moment for me. And, I tracked down, as I say, the mother, and I spoke to the clinicians at the therapy, and I was like, this can't be going on. And they were like, the whole thing here is that we can't ever report anyone to authorities. So we don't even get their real names. His name isn't really Max, and the therapists don't have his real name either. So he's like, there's not much we can do, unfortunately. And I was like, so yeah, that was horrible. And I think what really threw me there was like how blatant he was. He's trying to say to me, I'm a good person and you need to listen to us because we're good people, and we're pedophiles, we have the attraction, but we would never offend. But then he meets me in a public swimming pool with a little girl. And it's just like, what message are you trying to send? It's like he was playing with me. And I don't think he was. I just think he was maybe in a very awkward way trying to say, look how normal I can be. I'm at a swimming pool. I'm around all these kids and I'm not being weird. I'm not looking like I'm aroused. See how normal we are. And I just think it went down really badly. So what I would say is he was an example, and many of them were, of people who were socially very awkward. And I guess that's bound to happen if, when you're 16, 17, you start dating other people your age, all your friends go off and get girlfriends or boyfriends or husbands and wives, eventually families they raise, and you're always sort of, uncle so-and-so. Now, a lot of people take immense pleasure from being an uncle or an aunt, so I'm not dismissing that at all. But if the reason you're an uncle or an aunt is because you have a very, very secret, horrible thing that if anyone knew, they would potentially murder you, then I think it might affect your ability to socialize and be around normal people.
Well, yeah, for sure. And so how much did you speak with the therapist? Because what I'm interested in is their methodology. So pedophile comes to them, says, I have these urges to sexually abuse children. Please help me to refrain from doing so. So what would the therapist do to help them to develop techniques of suppressing those urges?
Well, the first thing they do, which really surprised me, was they have to actually filter out those who are not really pedophiles. And a lot of people go because they have something called POCD, which is pedophile obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's amazingly common. And again, I would say to anyone listening, if you know somebody who suffers badly, I'm not talking about like, oh, they have to put milk in the fridge upside down or whatever. I'm talking suffers badly from OCD. From my experience, it's very likely they have POCD, because OCD is about intrusive thoughts. That's one of the worst parts. Of course, everybody experiences it differently, but intrusive thoughts are hugely important in OCD and insufferable. And you often think, what would be the worst thing ever? and you often think everyone must think I'm the worst thing ever. And inevitably that leads to pedophilia. So there's a huge amount of people suffering with OCD, and their biggest concern is that you're going to think that they're a pedophile, and they're not. Sometimes they'll disguise that. So I've interviewed people with OCD who have said like, oh, my biggest concern is people think I'm a serial killer. People are going to, and when I hear that, immediately I think, you're not telling me the truth here. And I understand why you're not, because you don't want me to link the other thing. But no, I don't think anyone's worried that everyone else thinks they're a serial killer. This guy who told me that does not look like a serial killer. Does he look like a pedophile? Well, everyone does, anyone. I guess a serial killer, it could be anyone as well, but so does a pedophile. So that's what they're worried about. So they filtered that out, and they weren't clear what they do for that. I guess there's a lot of therapy and questions to be asked and stuff. I did ask at one point, like, do you do that thing of like putting the string around the penis, seeing if it's sort of, that kind of thing? And they were like, they didn't give me a proper answer on that. So I think that has gone on and maybe is a bit outdated now, to just sort of check for arousal and it would never be looking at children, but it would be looking at adults who look like children. There's like I think it's called the Tanning scale or the Tanner scale, which is like there are adult women and men who have bodies that appear to be childlike. So that's the first thing they do. Then, as I said before, not much you can do with the psychopaths, but the psychopaths aren't going voluntarily to get help and therapy anyway. So then you've got these other people. So what they do is they teach them, basically. It's a lot of talking. It's a lot of making people understand cognitive biases and stuff, and they teach them about their risk factors. So one of the main risk factors is alcohol. So they're basically told, look, you want to be a part of society, you want to make sure you don't offend, no alcohol, no drugs, none of that stuff. Right? That is the worst possible thing in terms of affecting your judgment. You can't be doing that anymore. Another risk factor is just simply being around children, right? Which is so obvious to the rest of us. And as I said before, like, you'd be amazed how resistant some of these guys are to that idea, because they're just like, no, but I can control. And I'm at, one guy on my podcast, he even said, because he was the class president and he did all this after school stuff with the kids, the younger kids, just, helping them out and whatever with their homework and stuff like that. And he said, like, if I wasn't able to do that, I'd be more likely to offend. And I said to him, like, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're not near them, you can't offend. And he was just like, you don't get it. So he was a perfect example of somebody who needed to go to therapy and have years of therapy. And I think he was considering it, but he was just so overconfident, that particular guy. And he's just like, I'm fine. I'm never going to offend. I know I won't. And I just have this feeling, and that's it. But I'm sure as he gets older, that starts to become more difficult. The third risk factor is something that wasn't really related to them. It's something I touched on before. The third risk factor is stigmatization. And we know this again with other types of crime. If you're made to feel like you're a monster, I think it's basic human psychology that you just go, well, screw it. I'm a monster then. I'll do what I want. And as I said before, you get pushed into that dark corner. You stop interacting with other members of society. Everybody tells you, the mainstream are just out to get you, and they don't understand children the way we do, and all that stuff. So I suppose a therapist considers it a success if after a couple of years they've gotten their patient into a position where they've given up alcohol and drugs, where they have made sure they're still part of society and don't feel stigmatized against. And what was the third one now? I forgot what the third one was. What was it? The three: stigmatization, alcohol, being around children. And they've gotten to a point where they're no longer in jobs, professions, hobbies that are around children. And I think that's more or less all they can do. It's about reintegrating them into society in a way where they feel responsible for their actions.
Yeah, one issue that's come up because a company developed these anatomically realistic dolls for pedophiles, where it's a doll of a child and they could have sex with it, and maybe that could prevent them from doing it with to a real child. And a lot of people would say, no, don't give them that. Don't give them anything. I don't know, but I just kept thinking, but if that could prevent them from offending against a real child, what's the problem? So have you encountered that issue as well?
I gave a lot of thought to it because I know that those dolls are illegal in some countries and not in others. And it's a fascinating idea because it sort of it speaks to our humanity and what our humanity is and what we want. Again, going back to that island, that Lord of the Flies society, what do we all agree should happen? And it might be that we do not like the idea of even symbols of children being abused, so to speak. And that might be a line for all of us. That said, these things are best looked at if our job is, as you say, I mean, to curb child abuse, right? If that is, and that should be our job, that should be the one thing most of us want to do as a society. I can't think of a more noble cause than trying to curb child abuse. So what we don't know, if we want to look at this clinically, is how much that would help, because we would have to do clinical studies, right? But how do you do clinical studies on that? Like, say to these guys, here, have a doll, and then let us know next week if you abused a child. I suppose they could report and say, like, I felt more of an urge to do it with the child afterwards or not. But then it's about how honest are they to themselves about it? So we don't entirely know. And the other theory, and again, it doesn't have much evidence behind it, but that it's a what do you call it when it's like a drug, a gateway? That's a gateway drug, so to speak. You get used to doing it with the model or the doll, and the next thing is like, okay, now I want a real version of that. So the two arguments is either that, like, it's a gateway drug, or it's like enough for them, and then they won't do it to real children. And we just don't have the evidence right now.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, yeah, YouTube banned your videos because pedophiles used to go to the comments sections and prey on children there. Yeah. Wow. So they've become very stringent about screening content. Like, I can't, if I'm going to produce a video about a serial killer, I can't put serial killer so and so. I just put their name now, because otherwise, yeah, they won't monetize it.
Yeah, it's such a shame. It's like, that's not what you are, it's the collateral damage is you, or it's me in a lot of these as well. I get demonetized videos now just for like mentioning the word racism or something. I had a guy called Coleman Hughes who came on to talk about racism and both sides of it, and I thought it was an interesting discussion, and just the word racism. And I thought that was ironic because the word racism, like, a racist is unlikely to actually use that word because they often don't consider themselves to be racists.
Yeah, it's true.
Racism is, it's a word often used by people decrying it, and criticizing it. But what can you do?
So did this clinic, did they treat people from around the world, or were they just treating German pedophiles?
Well, it's state-sponsored, so it was mostly Germans, but a lot of people moved to Germany for the treatment. I spoke to one English person who had moved his whole life there, but then he couldn't quite get it working with insurance. I can't remember all the details with that, but he moved to live there. There was a Dutch guy as well, a Swiss guy who had offended. A lot of these guys I met who called themselves non-offenders had, one stage offended. And that's what a clinician told me at one point, was like, a lot of them will do it once when they're a teenager and they'll realize how horrible it felt and how wrong it was, and they won't do it again. But very many of them, and this guy I met in the swimming pool said the same thing. Once or twice when he was like 18, he did something like that with a child. So yeah, a lot of people move there for this, and it is moving itself to other countries. So I think India now has it. It's called Kein Täter werden, which is don't offend, and they're trying to move that to India, and I think of one or two other countries they were looking at when I last checked in with them. And it just depends on the appetite of each country to initiate something like that. But if you've got these people who are moving country just to get help because they so don't want to offend and to abuse children, it makes sense to me, at least. Like, hey, let's hear them out. Let's let them go, because otherwise they're just going into the dark corners, And also, I should add to, you asked before what they were like. Like, I think we do imagine these sort of what pedophiles are like, I should say, or pedophiles. We pronounce it slightly differently in the UK as like an E sound instead of air. But there were a lot of the ones you'd expect who were maybe like the school janitor and so on. But there was also, like, I met a woman. It was one woman I met who I went to the village where she lives to meet her and spend a day with her. And she was 25 years old, quite, attractive and normal looking. You'd never know. You'd walk past her on the street without even thinking. And she had an attraction to very young children from the ages of like 1 to 3 or 4. So it was really quite extreme. And I tried to say to her, like, I refused to believe it almost. And I was saying, like, isn't that some sort of maternal thing? And I feel like it might be. It's like a confusion of some sort of maternal or paternal thing if you want, if you're attracted to someone that young. But yeah, I spent the day with her, and her boyfriend was also one of those people, a pedophile, I should say. So, and they helped each other to not offend by supporting one another, which I thought, well, good on them for that. But yeah, they come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, I'd imagine. And there are countries actually that have a really widespread problem with pedophilia. I'm not surprised that India has that clinic because they have a big problem with child prostitution there. It's also a problem in Pakistan. There's a lot of pedophilia. It's interesting because these are actually sexually repressive societies. Like in India, it's taboo to shake a woman's hand, to kiss her on the cheek in public. And yet, on the other hand, you have this pedophilia. So it's interesting how they keep sexuality so under wraps, and yet it seems to, when it gets squeezed out, it's in the the worst form imaginable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny how, I mean, look, your podcast is Human Monsters. Mine is On the Edge. These are, titles that suggest fringe subjects. And I think we both do interview fringe and controversial people about controversial topics. But I feel like you're on board or in line with where I stand on this. And I think it's that everything in moderation, which is a phrase I really like, everything in moderation. I know it's a bit cliche and it's a bit simple. And it's about as far away as you can get from like Human Monsters and On the Edge. But ultimately, I do feel like most societies where they've been like, okay, well, a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of left wing, a bit of right wing, a bit of we'll try not to be sexually repressed, but let's not go crazy with everything. I think that's the closest we can get as a society of 70 or 350 million people to having as many sane, rational people as possible, just trying to do things in moderation. So when you repress things like that, I think it can lead to all sorts of horrors.
Oh yeah, like Psychology 101 states you repress something, it comes back with a vengeance. And I mentioned those countries, and I think Africa is a place where they also have very conservative religious views on sexuality, and yet rape and much of the rape is directed at children, happens there in such epidemic proportions that it's unrivaled by any other place in the world. It's
crazy.
There are men there who believe that if you have HIV and you rape an underage girl, that you'll be cured of it.
Well, that's just lack of education, isn't it? That's a huge part of it, lack of education and all that kind of thing. It's just a very sorry state of affairs, and I don't know what one can do about it. I mean, if you've got, like I say, one in 100 men, because it is slightly lower with women, I should add, but it's still existent. In America, 3.5 million people. Well, look at the whole of Africa, the whole of India, the whole of Asia. It's a lot of people who've got this urge. It's actually staggering worldwide, the number of men who have an attraction towards children. That's why I wanted to write that book, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to, because it's just like, how do we not have, we've got loads of academic stuff that people can't even understand, like it's boring to read, real sciencey stuff. There's not one of like a journalist going, hey, I'm going to go into this community and try and understand them, particularly the non-offenders, the ones trying not to. What's 1% of 8 billion? I don't even know. It's just an extraordinary number of these people. And if you've got a country where the rules are not quite as stringent around that, then of course they're going to take advantage of it. And it's not a good thing. I do a lot of work on cults as well, people who leave cults, people who've been in cults, whether it be Scientology or even religions and things. You know, people have had a lot of trouble in Jehovah's Witness, for example. Some of the really extreme ends of Hasidic Judaism, like the really extreme, and I should say, just before anyone gets upset with all of these, whether it's Jehovah's Witness, Hasidic Judaism, Mormonism, Christianity, all of them, like the extreme ends is where it's at. It's really, really extreme. But as you say, it's like the repressed, strict rules, and then that stuff goes on, and it's allowed and covered up. There's been loads of scandals in the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, around that, because they say that it didn't happen. I think it's called the 2-person rule or something. They'll say like it didn't happen unless 2 like fellow Jehovah's Witnesses were around to witness it.
Wow. Yeah. It's a very common thing actually in cults for some kind of sexual impropriety to go on, like the so-called. Well, they were originally called the Children of God cult. Now they're called. Then they were the Family International. Now they're just called the Family. But the founder, David Berg, was a pedophile and encouraged everyone who was a member to have every adult to have sex with children. The actor River Phoenix, his family was part of it. He lost his virginity to an adult female at the age of 5. Isolation is the number one tool of an abuser, and the cults do isolate their members from society. And what did you find was a common denominator in terms of the pedophiles' ability to get access to children? How did they meet them? How did they manage to get them alone?
Well, I should say the vast majority that I met were, as I say, non-offenders, so they weren't trying to get them alone to abuse. And I think they were the ones who interested me more, just as a journalist, because it's like, wow, to have that in your mind. Because now I'm writing this other book about the psychology of secrets. I know that like a lot has been done on identity, keeping a secret about, someone's birthday or what you did yesterday or whatever is not so bad, but keeping a secret about something that is somehow wrapped up in your own identity, that's a killer. And that's going to be true of pedophiles, particularly the non-offending ones. It's also true of, gay people in societies where you can't be gay. Alan Turing, famously, I don't know if he took cyanide or ate an apple. That was, but I don't, but it seems like he killed himself. He was on the, what are they called? The blockers. What are those pills called? I should know that.
Beta blockers?
No, but when you've got to take them to limit your sexuality, castration.
Chemical castration.
Chemical castration. How did I forget that term? But chemical castrations. What is going on? And I think again, people aren't even sure how much that really works. I think I did meet someone who'd had a lot of it, and he's looked a bit like maybe a cancer patient. He was very, very skinny and gaunt, looked a lot older than he was. And he was miserable and depressed, but I don't know what the alternative is. It seemed to be working, at least with him. So yeah, I was really interested in the non-offenders, like living with these secrets, living with this like constant battle in your mind. I did meet one offender who I can't recall his name right now, but he was a former police officer who is from the west of Germany, and he is an advocate for child-adult relationships. He's not a good guy, but he wouldn't be honest with me, so I couldn't really ask him, how do you get children alone? Because he wouldn't even go on the record as saying that he's ever done that. I went and met him with one of the therapists, not from Don't Offend, but from another, who deals with child abuse and stuff, who himself had been abused as a child, because I wanted to confront this offending pedophile with this therapist who can say how awful it is when you do that to children, because he was in denial about it, but also might have been a bit of a psychopath. So I don't know how they do it, but like I was saying before, an inordinate amount of them are finding jobs where they are in close relations to children. It is, I don't want to worry people, but it is a bit scary. It is worrying. This guy who was babysitting the kids at the swimming pool. I mean, obviously my first thought, and I think most people's first thought there is like, how could the mother allow that? But the second thought then is like, what's he doing? Because I couldn't think of anything worse than my friend saying to me, like, hey man, can you just look after my kids for the day and take them to the pool? Like, oh, like what a boring thing to have to do. What an awful boring thing. So a lot of those guys do want to do that, and so they'll volunteer, and that's how they get alone with children.
And the one you just mentioned was in denial. What kind of things would he say to downplay it or put a spin on it?
He was a really creepy guy, this former police officer guy. He was really creepy. And so we sat with him and he sort of had a wry smile. And whenever I said, like, so, you know, had you been with children and so on, he would sort of smile like, that's not something I can talk about. You know, he didn't speak any English. So I had to, my German's okay. And we were having this conversation and it was all just a bit awkward. But yeah, he did say like that, the stuff that we've heard before, I suppose. He said children don't mind it if you're nice to them, and there are ways of doing it. Like it's supposed to be a love thing, and you guys are the problem, you know, because you've got this warped mind, and this is a thing of love and beauty, and it's all the stuff you could read in Lolita, really, that sort of warped idea of love. And even if you took away the concept of, like, you know, how harmful it is to the child, again, most of us would not be satisfied by the idea of a relationship with such a power imbalance, when you're talking to people with no worldly or life experience and trying to see them as an equal. I mean, just that, even without the sexual element, just think how damaging that is. Many of us would have had parents or family members who treated us too early as adults and made us grow up too fast. We've all experienced some semblance of that. There's just so much wrong with it, but these guys are a little bit off, you know, for lack of a better or more scientific term. They're a bit off.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier how many of them were kind of childlike in their own right, like Michael Jackson. Did you find that was a commonality in the disposition? Like, one thing I read was, you know, a lot of them have low self-esteem. They're kind of bashful. They don't look you in the eye that much. Was that something you encountered a lot?
Yeah, 100%. But again, it's that chicken and egg situation, you know. I'm in a situation here where, okay, so there was another guy who I made a video about and did put it on YouTube. I wouldn't do that now because they would just give me a strike. But I think it's still on there somewhere. I should probably delete it before they give me a retroactive strike. But it was a guy I interviewed in a park in Berlin, and we did a video. A friend of mine came and filmed it. And we filmed him from behind because we couldn't show his face because he didn't agree to that, and he'd have gotten beaten up or whatever might have happened to him. But he told a story about how he said he hardly ever offended, but when he did one time, it was his nephew. So he took the child away on holiday with him, and, you know, stuff happened, and he explained all this stuff. You know, one thing led to another, and he did, you know, he did feel bashful. And but I mean, how much of that is the fact that here I am, this, relative to him, high status journalist from another country who's over in Germany going, tell me about these awful things you did. And then he's going and telling me the awful things. Perhaps if I had met him at his local soccer club, I'd have seen a very different side of him. And in fact, I did, with my cameraman. We were walking. He was a friend of mine, the cameraman. So we were just walking somewhere in Berlin just a couple of weeks after filming, and we spotted him just out walking around, this guy. And it's funny because my cameraman, Thomas, and we both had exactly the same feeling. When we interviewed him, I almost felt sorry for him at certain points. And you see him like a subject of your film, that you've got your documentary hat on and you're sitting there to do some work and you're talking about, and he looked very repentant and stuff. But when he was walking down the street, he was wearing like cowboy boots and a cowboy hat and a big blonde wig. And he was walking with this guy who also looked a bit different, and he looked happy. And we hated him. My friend Thomas and I, we saw him, we just hated him and just thought, oh, you disgusting man. And I guess he'll have known that. He'll have sensed that. Had he come to the interview with that sort of smiley, arrogant, you know, he wouldn't have come across well and would have hated him for it. So people will always describe those pedophiles like that, sort of bashful and shy and nervous. And it's just about, you know, how much of that is because of what they are talking to you about, how much of it is who they are, and it's a bit of a mix, I think.
And where do you stand on a TV show like To Catch a Predator? I don't think there's a British equivalent. But for anyone who's not aware of it, this guy, he goes online and meets pedophiles and pederasts and tells them he's like a 12-year-old girl, 13-year-old girl, meet me here. And then the guy shows up, and then surprise, surprise, it's an adult man, and he's nailing them for making an appointment to have a sexual encounter with an underage female. Yeah, where do you stand on that kind of show and that kind of practice? Because it's also done off TV as well.
Yeah, well, Chris Hansen, there's the host of that show. I interviewed him on my podcast, which was great to be able to do. He's an interesting person in himself. He's had all sorts of controversies in his life, not related to pedophilia though, related more to taxes and things like that, I think. But and I don't know enough about that, I should just say. I just know that there's been some controversies. That's all I know. But yeah, he's great. And I think, as with any reality TV show, and that's what it is, it's reality TV, we're watching real life. It has a lot of issues around it. A lot of the people that he catches are clearly mentally ill. But then that leads us to that thing you said right at the beginning about, well, is pedophilia itself a mental illness? And then we are essentially catching and rounding up and showing off on TV a bunch of mentally ill people with problems. The other side of that is, if it even stops one person from abusing a child because they think, shit, what if it's Chris Hansen, or just the people he actually catches, they're in prison, maybe they won't do it again. If that means one child throughout the whole series, what was it, 12 years or something? If one child didn't get molested, and that child won't even know who they are, because it didn't happen, then it's worth it by a million miles. And that's a really difficult, again, just as a society, that's a really difficult thing for us to grapple with. There's that, I can't remember what it's called. There's that theory about like you would have in a perfect society. You can never have a perfect society in terms of convictions. You're always going to get innocent people in jail, but a good ratio that we can live with is one innocent person in prison for 10 guilty people. Some people change that to 100. That it should be 100 guilty people for one innocent person in prison, because having an innocent person in prison is the worst thing in the world. If it means you're catching and ruining the lives of 10,000 mentally ill and very vulnerable, weird people by showing them off on the TV, but you're saving one little girl or little boy's life effectively, then I think it's probably worth it. What do you think?
Well, law enforcement officials are not keen on that show and on the people who do it off TV. Because actually they said, the methodology of investigating a crime, it's so many protocols, so many details, so many things that if it's not handled carefully, the perpetrator's lawyer will totally, take advantage of any violation of any protocol and get the offender acquitted. And the thing is, if they didn't have sex with an underage child, then the crime didn't happen, right? I mean, there's intent, but how far can you go with that? The intent. I mean, you can say to someone, if you come near me again, I'm going to kill you. But does that mean that you should be charged with the intent to commit murder? And then,
well, that's rhetoric, though. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like the only way you can charge someone for this is if they were on probation for that particular kind of crime, because typically you're forbidden from using the internet, from interacting with children. So yeah, and under that circumstances, that you could definitely put them away. But if they don't have a record and you're luring them under false pretenses, their lawyer could probably get them out of it if they were charged with anything. So
it's a tough one, isn't it? I don't know enough about the laws around it. I always got the impression from watching the show that they did lock up quite a few guys. Maybe they didn't go away for quite as long. But what's the alternative is waiting till they've actually abused the child And that's just, that's ruining a life. So you can't, you couldn't have Chris Hansen sort of jumping out the closet or something after that's been done. So there's also, of course, so that show, I think they did work with police in advance of, trapping these people and finding these people. So, but that's obviously that's an exception, isn't it? Because it's, huge budget and big show. There are vigilante pedophile hunters. They can go a bit rogue. There have been instances of them turning out to have been pedophiles themselves. As anyone who takes such an interest, it's a little bit like the religious stuff, homophobic people back in the day often turned out to be gay themselves. The people who are so intent on catching all the pedophiles, sometimes they're hiding something themselves, or, as you point out correctly, they've not done their homework properly and they've foiled a case that the police might have already been working on, or ruined it because they assaulted the person, and all these things. So it's an incredibly complicated part of society, catching pedophiles, offending pedophiles, and it's made more complicated, I think, by the rest of us closing our eyes to the whole thing, putting our head in the sand, refusing to talk about it. That's why I wanted to call that book "We Need to Talk About Max." There was the reason I mentioned earlier, which was just about making it a more open conversation, so that these people don't just go to the dark corners of the web, so that they know they have a responsibility in our society not to offend. And then the other reason we need to talk about it is because we have to agree on a way that we can go about stopping these people, because I think it's like a huge proportion of offenders unknown to the child. A huge proportion of them are family, the most trusted people. And what do we even do with that? Because I guarantee no one listening to this is going to say, gosh, I better not leave my kids with my brother or sister, because we trust them. But we also know that almost all of the pedophiles, so it's another case of almost none of your siblings and family members are pedophiles, but most of the pedophiles who offend are siblings known to the victim. And that's just a really hard thing for us to grapple with. And it's something that we need to speak about a little bit more to see how we're going to handle it.
Yeah, the solution is publish your book, educate people, make that kind of thing available to the academic community. Instead of just a book about every paraphilia, they need to focus on the one that's causing the most harm.
Yeah, I think so. One day, maybe in a couple of years, I can get that one out. There is a chapter in the one about secrets. That's with Pan Macmillan, the publisher. That's out next year. And there is an entire chapter devoted to pedophilia as one of the secrets, so hopefully that will be interesting enough for people, and we'll start a conversation and could lead to the second book being entirely on that subject.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to plug?
No, just look, On the Edge with Andrew Gold. It's on the audio channels, wherever you get your podcasts, and it's on YouTube as well. And I do all sorts of different topics. So come and join and say that you came from Human Monsters, because I'm always interested to see where people have first heard about the podcast from.
Yes, sounds like a fascinating show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us today, and have yourself a great evening.
You too. Thank you.
Take care, man.
Take care.